We have a packed agenda today, and I want to get going. We have a lot of topics we want to cover that we hope will be helpful to you. Again, this is the first of several conversations that we're going to be having with you all, hopefully to share information about how this entity validation process has changed, improvements that we're making to the current experience, and what you should expect. I know I already said this, I'm going to say it again. We're obviously not going to be able to address everybody's individual situation, but we will try to cover as much information as we can. Today's session, this first one that we're holding today, it's geared more for entities that have already begun the registration process, or if you're currently in the process of renewing your registration. And if you've had a hiccup or something, today's program is for you. For entities that haven't started yet, if you haven't started to register yet, or if you haven't started to renew just yet, we'll be holding another session next week that'll be more geared to what information that you'll need to know while starting the process. Put it together, all the training sessions that we're going to do, they're going to cover the entity validation process of the phase of SAM.gov registration. So feel free to join either or both of the sessions that you think might apply more directly to you. In today's session, just again, so that we're all on the same page, we're going to be highlighting information that we hope will help. And information today will be relevant if you've already started to register for the first time in SAM.gov, if you're renewing or updating your registration in SAM.gov, or if you're trying to just validate your entity just so that you can get a unique entity ID. So one last thing about Zoom and its chat functions. There are two, I mentioned this a little bit ago, there are two separate chat functions. There's a chat box where you can make any comments or chats. But if it is a question that you really want us to address, again, probably won't be able to get to it today. We can try and get back to you at a later date, but make sure you put it in the Q&A chat box. And that's on the bottom of the Zoom box, and it's right to the right of the participant list. So anything that you do want answered, make sure it goes in that Q&A chat box for us. So with that, I want to turn it over to our first speaker, our Assistant Commissioner Dave, and he's going to take it from here. So go ahead, Dave.
Thank you, Ken, and good afternoon for many, and good morning for everyone else. My name is Dave Zbenich, or Dave Z, and I'm the FAS, the Federal Acquisition Service Deputy Commissioner and the Director of the Technology Transformation Services, or TTS. My pronouns are he and him. And I really wanted to take a moment to speak with you all directly today. TTS and the integrated award environment includes SAM.gov. And this is really the first opportunity, as Ken said, one of hopefully many that we'll be able to speak to you about the entity validation service issues and others. So at the outset, as Ken mentioned, if you're here, I'm assuming that you are currently moving through the entity validation process within SAM.gov. Some of you will have very few challenges when you go through that process. You'll be able to complete your entity validation in a timely manner. But for others, this process may be and has been extremely frustrating. And I wanted to take a few moments to acknowledge that, and also to let you know that we at GSA recognize the impact of the delays and the hardships that they have caused for you and the organizations that you lead. Please know that we have made overcoming these challenges our top priority at GSA and TTS. And we believe that every interaction with the government is an opportunity to demonstrate that we can deliver and create trust. Customer experience is at the foundation of everything that we do, and we know that we can and will do better. And although we are making progress, we know that there are plenty of entities who are waiting for their case to be resolved, and resolving those cases is paramount for us, and we will not let up until all entities can register in SAM on a predictable and timely basis. I'd like to maybe take a moment and step back and provide a little bit more context about what is happening, why it's happening, and what we're doing about it. So as many of you may know, we moved in early April of 2022 from the DUNS number to a SAM-generated unique entity ID, what we call the UEI. And that transition was completed in early April of 2022. So now all organizations are required to have a UEI as the official US government entity identifier for all systems when it comes to prime federal awards. At the same time, as part of a separate but related process, we changed the entity validation service, or EVS, provider. And before April 2022, this annual entity validation process was done entirely outside of SAM.gov. And now it's done within SAM.gov. And that process exists to prevent improper payments, to avoid procurement fraud, to help ensure the integrity of government contracts and financial assistance processes. And with these changes, all entities, whether you're doing your annual renewal or whether you're brand new to the system, need to validate your entity. And when we plan for this change, we resource based on anticipated validation needs. In actuality, however, the needs far surpass what we expected. In the first 4 months, we've received over 254,000 cases, and our total volume is pacing at about 10 times the anticipated annual volume. So the sheer volume of requests that we have had at SAM.gov has been a challenge. In addition, we know that there are challenges where entities' information do not match in the new database. In these cases, the renewing entity would need to submit additional documentation into SAM to complete the validation process. And these data discrepancies have caused delays for about 20% of new and renewing entities having to go through a manual review process. Now, what I can tell you is that we are working to address each case as quickly and efficiently as possible and to improve the new system for both new and renewing entities in a bunch of ways. This includes substantially scaling up the resources to support entity validation processing. We've dramatically increased the throughput, resolving thousands of cases each day and working with several more thousands who are in the queue. And we're working with other federal agencies to identify opportunities to reduce the impact on entities, looking to new user pathways for assistance as issues are escalated, and continuing to work with industry groups and making technical and workflow improvements based on user feedback. For example, just this morning, after partnering with the Office of Management and Budget and partner agencies that represent our governance bodies, we're able to provide short-term extensions to over 19,600 SAM registrants. And that's not going to solve everyone's problems, and many of you in this room are not likely affected by it, but we are looking for opportunities to provide relief every single day. And we're going to continue to look for all available options to improve the process for registrants, both existing and future registrants. And in the coming days, you can expect to see some changes to the validation pages in SAM.gov. This will include updates to our on-screen instructions and help, and we believe that these updates will help you, the users, get through the validation process more effectively. And although I want to let everyone know that we are continuing to work hard to address the remaining challenges, one of the other things that we know we must do is better improve our processes, timeframes, and efforts, and make that more transparent and visible to everyone. Our goal as an agency is to make it easy for businesses, nonprofits, and other governmental agencies, and partners to do the critical work of government. And these validation issues have made it harder for too many organizations. We are doing all that we can to resolve these issues as quickly as possible, and we'll continue to push for better outcomes for our partners, both inside and outside government. Today, as Ken mentioned, we'd like to provide more information about the process overall, while also drilling into specific challenges many of you may be experiencing and providing with more help. Unfortunately, we are not going to be able to provide answers to each individual issue. There are 2.7 thousand participants who are currently signed into the Zoom, and we just cannot possibly handle all of the potential tickets in this particular call. That said, we do want to emphasize that we are committed to improving your customer experience and ensuring process. And as of last night, we have resolved over 86% of all the requests that are received. And the team is reducing average entity validation cycle time, and we expect and hope to have those times be shorter moving forward. In addition, at the end of the event, we will have a poll to better understand if this information is helpful and what additional information you're looking for. This will allow us to iterate and improve to meet your needs specifically. And once again, I want to thank you all for your patience during this process and for the opportunity to meet with you all today. We know that this has been an extremely difficult process, and we are committed to making sure that we deliver an excellent customer experience, and we will not let up until we do so. I'd like to now pass it on to Kat Rollins, who is our lead program manager for SAM.gov. Kat, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you, Ken. As Dave was mentioning, the first topic.
Hey, Kat.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I hate to do this. I'm going to interrupt you right before you get started. We've had lots of people join in the last couple of minutes, and everybody is asking. I just want everybody to know the recording of this program and the slide deck itself will be made available in a day or two. It'll be posted on our blog at GSA Interact. And also you will get an email with a link to the deck and to the recording. So that is coming. Give us a couple days and you will get it. Sorry about that, Kat.
Thank you, Ken. And I know that is a hot topic, so it's a good one to interrupt with and make sure everyone is aware of that. So thank you. So as Dave was mentioning, my name is Catherine Rollins, and I'm the lead program manager for SAM.gov. And today's focus, as Ken and Dave are both saying, is around the folks who have already kind of started this process. So you're either an entity that has a current registration and you're trying to update it or renew it, or you're potentially a new SAM registrant or someone who is trying to get a UEI for your entity, and you're in this kind of validation hold area. So what we want to go through today is to start off with that broad view of what is entity validation and a little bit into what happened. Dave gave some details already. It's kind of a similar overview. Then I want to talk a little bit about how the entity validation works in SAM and hopefully some help. And that leads us into the next couple topics around what documentation is required and accepted and what isn't. This is probably the number one thing that we are seeing in resolution times and back and forth and questions that are being asked is around the documentation and what's needed there. So we do want to make sure that today we spend some time on that to help everyone out there. The next topic is around what do I do next after my entity is validated? So after you get that, everything's all clear, ticket is resolved, you know, what do you do next? So we're going to cover that as well. And then some high-level frequently asked questions about the validation process. So these are things that you specifically have asked either through FSD, we've gotten in questions or other formats. And so again, we want to cover those. Hopefully that will answer some of the things that we're already seeing in the Q&A, but get some of those high-level items for you. And then lastly, we're going to cover where do I get help? So as you are continuing through this process, or if a friend reaches out and says, hey, I know you went through this, I've got questions on it, some places that you can direct other folks to for help or yourself as you're going through it. And we're constantly updating these help documents, as Dave said, through interactions with our users and as folks are giving us feedback to the process and transparency of how can we help you out. So to kick things off in that, what is entity validation? So entity validation is very specifically around ensuring that the entity exists and is unique. And we do this through an entity validation service, which is independent verification of these items. This is critical to the federal award ecosystem because it ensures that we don't have improper payments, procurement fraud, and we make sure that we have that integrity of government contracts and grants processes. And when we're talking about trillions of dollars in taxpayer funds per year, this is a very, very integral part of the process that we have to ensure is documented and is processed correctly. So on the when is validation required for an entity? It is required when you're registering an entity. So if you need that full registration to get an award or a grant award, if you're renewing your entity registration each year, there is a additional piece that is needed there for when you're updating. If you're just getting a unique entity ID, and when you're updating or changing your entity's name or address. The idea around this is that every entity does go through this validation. And part of the fun that we've seen, as Dave was alluding to, is that we are with a new provider's database and data sources. So even if you already have an active registration, you're going to be seeing this request to go through the validation to ensure the existence and uniqueness of your entity. So I know many folks were with us with the transition from the DUNS number to the unique entity ID, which happened back in April of 2022. What happened here is the understanding that we went from the unique entity ID being a D&B identifier owned and managed by them to the unique entity ID that is given by SAM. And so when you go through the registration or the get UEI process, you get that unique entity ID directly from SAM now. There's no need to go to an outside source or an outside vendor to get that. You do just come directly to SAM, complete the process, and get the ID. The DUNS number has been removed from SAM. It's not used as that authoritative ID. It is now that unique entity ID. The other side to this is that Duns and Bradstreet in past was used both for that identifier and they were that independent validation service. So part of the April change was also establishing and moving away from the D&B validation service to a SAM EVS. What this means is, again, that idea of that validation, even if you're already an active registrant, is that you do have to come through and validate with this new EVS. The idea of validating an entity has always been required, and for the purposes of ensuring that we don't have fraud and proper payments and everything, it will continue. That requirement is not going away. What changed in April was the idea that instead of being outside of SAM, it is now a part of SAM. And so for the first time, a lot of folks are seeing this as a different or as a change. And so it was a part of the process. It's just now a part of SAM. It's a part of a new database. And so it's trying to align all of those things. As soon as the entity is in the new EVS with the correct information, there is not a need for the entity to do anything else. And we'll get to that kind of in the actions after the resolution of the ticket. But we do recognize that some entities renewing or registering for the first time are not in this new government-owned EVS database. And so what they are going through is they are being asked to provide documentation to verify that entity information. And so we're going to go through what that documentation looks like and how to help everyone through that. But we do recognize this is one of the pieces that folks are encountering and surprised by. And so we are trying to definitely work through that idea of things and how to help folks through this validation specific piece of things. Once the entity is in the EVS database, like we said, there's not a need to revalidate. The idea is that you might need to come back in for additional documents if the information has changed. So even before April, this was true. If the legal business name, if the physical address, doing business as, if those primary items are changing, then in order to update the entity information, documentation would need to be provided to say, here is the change and here's the proof that it has changed. So now that there's kind of an understanding of what the validation is, how does the entity validation work in SAM? So the specific process is the idea that when an entity, a registrant comes in, it is either through the, as I said, update process. So if there's a current registration for the entity, if the user is coming in for the first time to get a unique entity ID for the entity, or if the user is coming in for the first time to register the entity. In any of those cases, the user will start off with their normal process, and then they will reach a point that they will be told that they're going to need to validate their entity. At that point in time, the user is going to be asked to enter in the entity information, the legal business name, and the physical address. There's then a notification that we are searching millions of records, and that's going out to our new database to see if we have the entity there. The user is then brought through the idea of entering the incorporation information. And then there's the idea that the entity or the user can see the entity details. So if something was pulled back from the database that the user recognized as the entity that they are registering or that they need to get the UEI for, they can select that entity and move forward. There's also the option that if the user does not see the entity in that list, which is okay, because we understand the database is not 100%, then we work through adding that entity to the database. If the entity is found, we next, in step 6, ask the user if all the details are correct. We understand information about the entity is constantly changing potentially. And so the database may be a historical or an older legal name. It could be an older historical address. And so we want to make sure that we update those details at this time with the initial validation. If the entity is found and all details are correct and current, the user can say yes and continue through the unique entity ID process and then into the registration. If the details aren't correct or the entity is not in the database, again, that's okay. The user's then going to be brought down the path of making sure that we can update those details. And that's where steps on the slide 7, 8, 9, and 10 come in. And so it's the idea that we're going to be asking the user very specifically, okay, what's not showing up right? What should the correct current details of your entity be? Making sure that we're confirming those, that it's clearly understood what might be changing from our current understanding in our database to the new needs of the entity. And then asking for that documentation. And as Dave said, we've already done a number of updates to the system around trying to help the users with documenting the details and submitting the documents. There's definitely more work that we are doing and that is ongoing and improvements that will be seen upcoming around those screens and that current process. But the idea of needing to document your entity details and then submitting those documents, those are still in place and are still going to be required. If you are a user who had to go through and you submitted your entity documents, what happens at that point in time after step 10 is that on the back end, we are automatically creating from SAM a ticket for you. That ticket is routed to our EVS, or Entity Validation Service agents, for processing. Currently, we're averaging about 7 calendar days with correct documentation. And so that's, again, why a big piece of this conversation just a little bit is going to be around the documentation. That 7 calendar days does not apply when we don't have the right documentation or documents are missing. After the entity is correctly in the database and the user can claim that entity, at that point in time, again, you start back with step 11. You receive the validation, and then you're able to continue on to getting the unique entity ID. And if you're an entity that needs to continue into registration, you keep on going into step 13, which takes you into that core data of the registration and on into the other steps. So I was saying, one of the biggest items that we are seeing is around the documentation itself. So the idea of the validation is that we are establishing that the entity is an entity and that it is unique. And that is how you get the unique entity ID. So what is required and accepted and what is not? Because what we are trying to do is preventing fraud and ensuring that integrity of contracts and awards and payments, we can only accept documentation that is certified by an authorized source. So I will admit, I know we've seen things where it's a screenshot of the current SAM.gov registration. We have that information. We understand that there is this frustration point around, but I see my SAM registration, like that's my entity. Why isn't this accepted? It's again that idea of that independent verification of the entity information. And so when you're going through the process, if you don't see that current correct entity legal name and physical address, then it's going to need that documentation from an authorized source in order for us and the EVS agents to change the information, correctly have it in the database, and then allow the continuation of the unique entity ID assignment. We understand that for many folks, the idea of some of this documentation may not be on hand, that it may take time to go find the documentation or the resources. There is a, with the submitting of the ticket, we do have additional items and help, and I'm going to show those in a little bit as well, of the kind of documents that can be used and that are accepted. And we're hoping to get those to users in advance of entering the process so you can have those lined up in advance. But do recognize if something is submitted, a document that is not accepted, we do send out an email after there's a review of that documentation, letting you know that it was not what was needed and what might be able to be used. And I believe there's actually a link in those notices going out for the additional help. Oops, sorry. So in the idea of trying to help out the user with the documentation, we have added to FSD and to the SAM help area a number of knowledge articles around documentation. The one I'm showing now that has a short link listed off to the side is kind of a sampling or high level of the most commonly used acceptable validation documents. It has 3 columns of lists kind of by what are you trying to submit documentation for. Recognizing you may need more than one item to ensure that you have the supporting documents for everything that you see. So it's the idea that if you need to, if the documentation being submitted needs to be for the legal business name and for the address, then list A would apply. If you look in list B, that's for the start year and the state. There's a bunch of these, especially up at the top, like articles of incorporation that potentially can qualify for both list A and list B. So you would only need to document or provide the articles of incorporation if it shows the legal business name, the address, the start year, and the state. And if those are the things that you're trying to document. If for some reason the start year or the state does not show up on the documentation, so if you're using a doing business as document, for instance, it might not have the address on it. So that could only be used for list B, not list A. So you would have to provide additional documentation. So you're going to want to make sure that as you're going through this, that the documents you're providing do document each piece that you're changing to ensure that we have that validation, pardon me, for each item. Again, this is a sampling of items, the most commonly used ones, but hopefully it helps with the idea of what we're looking for or what is needed. So what happens after you submit the documents? So after you submit the documents, you'll be taken back to your workspace. That looks similar to this. At that point in time, if you need to update or you want to review the incident, you can again go into your entity workspace and you will see underneath where your entity is noted, there's an FSD incidents. This will be able to be expandable. And within this section is where you will find any FSD incidents that you have open for that entity. The formatting of the FSD information or the incidents is the INC-GSA FSD and then a number. That is the standard formatting for the tickets. If you are contacting even the FSD agent, it generally helps for them to know what that incident number is in order to do any sort of checks on the status or additional information. Once you locate the FSD incident that you are trying to review, there will actually be a view button where you can open and see the documents that you've already included. And if you receive a request from the EVS agent that additional documentation is needed, that is where you would add the additional documents. So again, if you get anything from the EVS agent who's reviewing your ticket and says, yes, you supplied these documents and that works for the entity name and the start date, but I'm not seeing anything with the physical address as we're trying to update it. And so that document is still needed. If you then find a document that has that validation on it and you want to update it, what you want to make sure you do is go into SAM.gov, going into your workspace, and then again, underneath the entity selector is that FSD incident. You select view, and then you can add or attach that new document. We do get asked a bunch of how do I know if I need to send different documents? The idea here is checking your email. So the EVS agent's correspondence is going to be through email from the FSD ticket. So if you get an email from the agent, it should say in there what document did not suffice or if no documents were found that had any of the information, and the idea that you would the ask to please add the correct documentation. At that point in time, again, what we're going to ask you to do is go into that workspace, select view, and enter or attach your documents to SAM.gov. From here, we are asking that, again, because the communication is through the FSD, if you just respond back to that email to let us know that you took action, and that way the EVS agent knows, okay, they updated the new documentation. Let me go back over there and take a look. There is a note on here that if we don't have that information, that the new documentation was added, the system does right now auto close the incident within 5 days. So again, so if you have new documentation that needs to be added, if you go into SAM.gov, select the view, and then from there attach your documents to the ticket, and then just respond back to the email letting us know that you attached the new document. It will keep the incident open. If we don't get that action though, then the incident will close in 5 days. Specifically within the SAM.gov portal, underneath that view, there's a place, again, where you'll be able to review the attachments that you already had. So if you're being told that this documentation was not correct, you can look to check and see what you already supplied. From here, you then know what potential other documents to add. If the agent already mentioned that the supporting documentation of file A did not suffice, make sure that you're not adding file A again. Sometimes we have seen that the user didn't know that that was the one that wasn't, so actually kept adding the same document again. So we do allow within the viewing of the SAM portal, the idea that you can see the current attachments that you've already done. And then right above that is where you can attach, choosing from folder directly from your computer to add additional documents. Those will also then show up in the attached area to show you the name and when they were uploaded. And again, as soon as you attach those new attachments, go ahead and respond back to that FSD email and make sure that you let us know that you attach the new documents. If the attachment is instead uploaded to FSD, those attachments have been getting deleted and the EVS agent is not able to take action on them. So we do really need the documents in SAM. If you have a question about your entity validation, the status of it, again, the idea that documents were requested and you think you've supplied the right one, or you have a question back on just what documentation change is needed, within FSD.gov, you can actually add a comment to your validation incident. So again, you can look it up after you log in based upon that INC GSA FSD number. And from there, up at there'll be an area where you can type your message and then select to send it. And that will let the EVS agent know, and it will populate the question there. So they will get that. Again, we know that there's a little attachment placed on FSD. We really ask that you do not add the documents to FSD.gov. The documentation really needs to be in SAM to ensure that there is that connection to the entity and the long-term value of those documents for the validation process. After the EVS agents gets a response or a question, if they're going to respond back, again, it's going to be through this ticket. So in this view, you will also be able to see the history of the back and forth with the agent. So again, if you have other questions from before, again, feel free to use this messaging within and the comments within the FSD portal. Some rules for successful validation. So again, one of the top things that we're seeing is, the turn or the delay on the resolution is in the documents being provided. So some high level items is if you're sending in like a bank statement or a utility bill, those do need to be less than 5 years old. And I think in our documents up above, there were asterisks around those things, around bank statements and utility bills, with the note that those need to be less than 5 years old. Also making sure that the documents you're sending in, not just that it's the right document, but that it actually has the right information on it. So like in this case, the understanding that if you're saying your company is ABC company, that the documentation also has that exact same ABC company. If it doesn't, it will come back as not the correct documentation, and the ask will be to have documents that actually show that correct legal business name exactly as we're wanting it, and the address. If your documents are in a language other than English, we will ask that you send both the non-English, the originals, and a certified English translation. For items where it's a scan or a photo, please make sure that it does have the full information on there when you're doing a review of the document, and make sure that it is legible for what the information is. One thing we've also seen is a number of original application or typed documents that don't have the a state seal, or that don't have other authorized signatures on it. We can't accept those things either. The idea is that we do need the final validation or the return from the state or from the government on those documents. We've also seen a couple times screenshots of a form where, again, the user is entering in the information. If it's the return or the acceptance of that form, then we can take that, but the actual data entry, we can't, because there's not actually a validation on that entered data, the return it would be. And then one note just on physical addresses, and this is per policy, but we cannot accept PO boxes for physical address. It does actually have to be a physical address for your entity. We do want to note that only the EVS provider can actually respond or communicate really on the ticket. The idea here is that calling the Federal Service Desk, those agents can tell you the status of the ticket, similar to what you would see when you log into FSD and pull up your ticket. That Federal Service Desk agent does not actually, they can't see the documentation, they can't access the documentation, and a lot of that is on purpose because of potential PII insecurity. And so the limitation of those extra checks is specifically with the EVS provider. So if you do have a question on your ticket or a follow-up item to it, again, definitely go into the FSD ticket and add a comment on there for the agent.
Hey, Kat, it's Ken. Just real quick, we're about 15-minute time check here.
Yes, thank you. So after you have the incident open, which I believe many of you are on the call because you do, what can you do? So the idea is definitely, like, if you would, please go back and check your documentation, right? All of the points that we've listed out before, make sure your documentation is that accurate, it's complete, it's showing all the right things. Monitoring your email, because if the EVS agent comes back with additional needs, that's how you're going to be getting those updates. And then making sure to respond to messages about your incident promptly to make sure the ticket stays open and active. If your registration renewal is upcoming, we're asking you to start early. And especially if you think there has been a change recently to your entity, either the legal business name or the physical address, go ahead and, again, through that link up above, start looking at your documents and prepping those in advance. As Dave said, we are closely monitoring the situation and we are looking and working to address each incident as quickly and efficiently as possible. This is our top priority, is to continue going through this, back-end changes, front-end changes, and direct usability with the users to help everyone get through this. What do I do next after my entity is validated? So this will kind of depend on what state you are in. So when you get that wonderful notice from the EVS agent that your entity has been validated and it is correctly in the database, what do you do next? You're going to want to come back into SAM to your workspace. And then if you are in the current pending ID assigned, you will want to go into the Get Started and then walk through the process, making sure that you select your exact match entity name and physical address. If your entity is in the ID assigned, so it has already been given that UEI, again, you'll want to make sure to go in, find your entity. From here, you're just selecting the Validate Entity underneath the actions. There's also an alert that shows up, making sure that you know those. So it should be kind of easy to spot in your list of ID assigned items. The next one is the work in progress. If that is the current state of your entity, you'll want to go into, again, that specific one. Underneath the actions, there'll be an option to update. And you'll want to go ahead and select that update from the actions menu. I will make a note here that if you are in the work in progress and you've gone kind of past the validation to another step, and then you need to make a change to the entity name or physical address. Right now, you need to, within the work in progress registration, that version, go in and delete that, right? Very specifically the work in progress one. New accurate entity name and physical address in that. So a couple high level frequently asked questions that we've gotten. The first one, if I already had a registration, why can't I find a match to the name and address in my registration? So this goes back to that idea that we were on a commercial provider database before April, and now we are on a government-owned database, and it is a different database. So this is ensuring that the correct information is being added and updated correctly for you, the users, and for the future. Why can't I find a match to the name and address I entered in SAM.gov? So again, it's the idea that we're checking against millions of records that are pulled from hundreds of official sources, trying to find a match to what you entered in SAM. In some cases, that might return with nothing. In some cases, we find close matches. In some cases, we find older things. But we are checking as many of the items as we can from that new government database. From here, it's the idea of making sure that we verify and update with the correct current information. And that's again where that documentation fund comes in. The next item is, why am I getting rejected at CAGE if I am validated in SAM? So some folks, this question may not apply to you. For those who do, have to go through the CAGE piece as well to get a CAGE code. The CAGE code process is handled by the Defense Logistics Agency, DLA. We send them the legal name and the address, and they run a separate validation. The resolution of CAGE code issues is handled directly with DLA. And if you're in this position, I believe there is a lengthy email that goes out that it's actually returned from CAGE to SAM of what the issue is or the question. We do notify the administrator or the person who is putting in the entity registration of what the issue is, and the understanding that we can't change that. It is a direct action or conversation that is needed with DLA and their CAGE folks. Why can't FSD agents provide answers about my documents? So again, a big part of this is around the idea that many of the documents that you are sending are not public documents. Some of them could contain PII or other items. So we do make sure that the Federal Service Desk agents can answer general questions about SAM and everything else, but the actual entity validation documents and reviews and everything else are with the EVS agents. So all of those communications and everything else is with those specific EVS agents, not with the Federal Service Desk agents. And I know that's separate, but there are security factors for that. So the best way to communicate if you have questions or anything else is through that chat feature in FSD. Well, I need to validate anytime I update my SAM.gov registration. So no-ish. So the idea here is that once you do the validation, that holds, right? Your information is in there and we're good to go. What you will be asked when you do an update or when you go to renew is if there is a change in the database. So again, we're pulling from many other sources. If there's a change to one of those that says, hey, the address has been updated, you might get a request for, hey, has your address actually been updated or not? There could also be a case where you have relocated, your entity has changed the address, and so you actually want to update the information, and we haven't triggered that. We have not, through all these other sources, it hasn't come to us. In that case, you would still need to provide the documentation for the change to the new address at that time. And then you would be able to keep going. What do I do if I need to change my name or address? So I'm not going to walk through all of that specific item right now. So if you've already validated, you're kind of coming through, you need to do an additional change. On SAM, under the help section, we do have information in there, and then FSD kind of has a step-by-step instruction and guides with screenshots of that process and how to go through it. So if you've already validated and kind of gotten through the first pass, and then you notice, oh wait, now I need to do a name change or address change, this is how you're going to find it. So where to go to get help? So if you're waiting for an incident to be resolved, the EVS provider will reach out to you. They'll request additional documentation or clarification potentially if needed, or they'll let you know it's all good to go, and then you can take those next steps. But just make sure that kind of right now that you're definitely checking for the current documentation that you submitted, that it has all the correct items in there and it's good to go. And that way, when the EVS agent gets to it, they can just process it, hopefully. We do keep updating our help information. So both on SAM.gov, underneath our help header, there is a section there specifically around validate my entity that does then take you to a full list of resources depending on what state you're in and what your specific question is, but it's all around validating your entity. The other area is directly on FSD.gov. There's a section there, again, validate your entity, that will also take you through those wider knowledge articles by topic for how to go through this process, or if you're in a specific step of the process and need help, there's also a lot of documentation there as well. And again, all of these we are updating pretty consistently with feedback and as we're making changes to the site and everything else as well. There's also the feedback tool that is not used for EVS issues. This is a more broad one, so I'm actually going to skip that. But and then again, if this is your first time joining us for the an Industry Day item, we do have a Interact community where we do post upcoming conversations. So I know Ken mentioned earlier that this is a part of a series we're going to be doing. That's the announcement of this series and invites and everything else you'll be able to see on that Interact community page. And at this point in time, I know I'm coming down to the wire here, and I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to make sure I got through all the important details, hopefully helpful information for everyone. I do want to turn it back over to Ken at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. I appreciate everybody sticking through with us for this presentation. We're at the end of it now, and I know it was a lot of information to get through. Again, I know I've said it several times, the slide deck itself, I know there were some people who maybe couldn't see it or whatever. So the deck itself and a recording of this event will be put on Interact. You're looking at the Interact website address right there on the screen right now. We'll put it on there in a couple of days. It takes us a day or two to download the video, but it'll be there. So you'll be able to go through this presentation. You'll be able to see this slide deck. Lots and lots of questions that we received today. A lot of it was answered kind of toward the end of the presentation. So we're hoping that we were able to answer a bunch of your questions. We're kind of up against it. We only have a few minutes left here. I do want to point out that at the very end, we're going to have a poll with some questions. And if you're able to stick on for a few minutes, we'd love you to answer these questions so that we might be able to improve future programs. And I'm actually going to open it up to some of our other GSA colleagues here. We received hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions. I don't, Nancy, anybody, are there some questions that we want to jump into at this point? We're going to leave this program open for so people can answer the poll questions.
Ken, the only thing I have to add, there were a couple questions. I just wanted to points of clarification possibly. So there's some questions around accessing a registration. You must have an entity administrator role to access an existing registration. There was a lot of information on the FSD about that. On the FSD.gov homepage, there's a whole section about what to do if I need to become the entity administrator. And then there was a couple questions around, if I already have a UEI, does that mean that I have been validated? No, there was a UEI assigned to every entity. It was registered in SAM back on April 1st. So everyone was assigned a UEI. That does not mean you are validated. When you come in to renew your registration, or when you need to update information in your registration, then you will be asked to validate. So you are not validated till you actually come back into SAM login and start the update process. Other than that, I think we covered most of the questions.
Great. Just one other thing I've noticed in the last 5 or 10 minutes, lots and lots of people asking about SAM. Registration in SAM is always free. There is never any charge to register in SAM. So if you're receiving other information or if you're getting emails, SAM registration is always free. Just want to make that clear. So with that, we're going to conclude today's program. But again, we're going to leave this window open for a couple of minutes. We did put out the poll. And if you have a minute or two to answer some of those questions, that would be great. And otherwise, stay tuned to Interact, and we'll get this information out to you as soon as we can. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today.